a billionaire heiress, crashed into his old truck. She didn't know he held her father's last secret. The city had taught Evelyn Reed that everything had a price. Time was a commodity. Loyalty was a line item on a balance sheet. Grief was a temporary liability to be mitigated with strategic philanthropy and a tightly controlled press release. She was fluent in this language of acquisition and divestment. It was the only tongue her father had ever taught her, a lexicon of calculated values where sentiment was a rounding error. Her arrival in the town of Havenwood was a divestment. A final, inconvenient entry in the ledger of her late grandmother's estate. The car, a gleaming black sedan that drank gasoline with silent, expensive thirst, felt alien on the town's main street. It moved too fast, its finish was too perfect. It slid past clapboard storefronts and a town square where a bronze soldier, green with age, stared into the middle distance. The town looked tired, worn down by winters and economic realities Evelyn could only guess at. She pulled up in front of the cafe. The Daily Grind. The name was an irony she found faintly pathetic. A painted sign, its letters peeling, swung on a wrought iron bracket, creaking a rhythm only the wind could hear. This was it. The last piece of a life she had never known, a connection to a woman who had existed for her only in birthday cards, signed with a shaky, unfamiliar hand. The air inside was thick with the smell of old coffee and something else. Dampness, deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the November wind whipping outside. It was a cold that came from the bones of the building itself. An old woman, Elara, her grandmother, sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that steamed weakly. She didn't look up when Evelyn entered. Her focus was on a man kneeling by the wall, his back to the room. He had a toolbox open on the floor beside him. The metal guts of a large, antiquated heating unit were exposed. He worked with a quiet economy of motion, no wasted gestures. His hands, calloused and capable, moved with a certainty that was almost hypnotic. He turned a wrench, listened, then tapped a metal coil with the handle of a screwdriver. A soft hum answered. Then silence. Evelyn's expensive leather boots made a sharp, intrusive sound on the worn floorboards. The man didn't flinch. Her grandmother finally looked up. Her eyes were pale blue, clouded by age but sharp with an intelligence that Evelyn had not expected. They held no warmth of recognition, only a weary appraisal. It was the look of someone who had seen too many seasons change to be impressed by a new one. Evelyn cleared her throat, the sound swallowed by the room's cold stillness. "I'm Evelyn Reed." Elara nodded slowly. "I know who you are. The heater is broken." The statement was flat, offered without apology or explanation. It was a fact, like the wind or the coming snow. Evelyn's gaze shifted back to the man. He wore a flannel shirt and faded jeans. He looked like every other tradesman she had ever hired and dismissed, a necessary function to be paid and forgotten. An inconvenience. She had a schedule to keep, documents to sign. A flight back to a world that ran on precision and efficiency. Can he fix it? He's trying. Elara's voice was dry as old leaves. The man slid a panel back into place. The metal scraped. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. He was taller than she had thought, with a lean, wiry strength. He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face. It was a face carved by the same elements that had weathered the town. Lines around his eyes, a stillness in his expression that felt less like peace and more like a carefully guarded perimeter. It's the ignition pilot. It's old. Parts are hard to find. His voice was low, calm. It didn't invite conversation. It merely stated a problem. Evelyn's patience, a resource she husbanded carefully, was already dwindling. Then find the part, or replace the entire unit. Send me the bill. She pulled a business card from her slim wallet, the crisp embossed paper a stark contrast to the worn wooden table. The man looked at the card in her hand, then at her face. He made no move to take it. Land doesn't rush, Evelyn. Her grandmother's voice cut through the quiet. Neither does Caleb. Caleb. The name hung in the air. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Elara, then packed his tools with the same deliberate care he had used to take them out. Each wrench and screwdriver clicked into its designated place. The sound was methodical, final. He would be back in the morning, he told Elara, not Evelyn. He had an idea, a way to bypass the faulty part until a replacement could be machined. He spoke of it as a puzzle, not a problem. Then he was gone, the small bell over the door announcing his departure with a single, forlorn jingle. The cold in the room seemed to deepen in his absence. Evelyn was left standing in the silence, holding a useless business card. She felt a prickle of annoyance, an unfamiliar sense of being dismissed. In her world, money was a key that opened any door. Here, it seemed the locks were different. Elara gestured to a dusty cardboard box on the chair opposite her. Your father sent that for you. Years ago. He asked me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand it wasn't about the money. I suppose now is as good a time as any. Evelyn looked at the box. It was sealed with yellowed tape. Her father had been a man of contracts and codicils, not sentimental packages. She had managed his empire for 5 years since his death, turning his legacy of ruthless acquisitions into a global powerhouse. She knew his mind, his methods, his bottom line. She did not know the man who would send a cardboard box to a forgotten cafe in a dying town. She sat, the expensive fabric of her coat whispering against the old wooden chair. She ran a manicured nail under the tape. It flaked away, brittle with age. Inside, nestled among old photographs and stock certificates for companies that no longer existed, was a single, thick envelope. It was made of heavy, cream-colored paper. It was not addressed to her. The name was written in her father's familiar, aggressive script. A fountain pen, black ink. Caleb Vance. The name struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked up, her carefully constructed composure fracturing. She stared at her grandmother, whose gaze was fixed on the failing heater, as if it held all the answers she refused to give. The handyman. The man who had refused her card. He held her father's last secret. And in that cold, quiet cafe, Evelyn Reed understood that the divestment she had come to execute was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The asset she was here to liquidate had a history, and the liabilities were not on any balance sheet she had ever seen. Evelyn spent that night in a sterile motel room on the edge of town. The heater there whirred with aggressive, artificial warmth. It couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep inside her. The envelope sat on the nightstand, a silent accusation. Her first instinct was to open it. Her father had taught her that information was power, a weapon to be wielded. Privacy was a luxury for those without stakes. But something held her back. It was the memory of Caleb Vance's eyes, the quiet dignity. The way he had addressed her grandmother, not her. He was a man who lived by a code she didn't understand. Violating his privacy felt like a tactical error. Instead, she did what she did best. She opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi was slow, intermittent, a digital reflection of the town's tired pulse. But it was enough. She was a master of the digital deep dive. She could unearth financial histories, hidden partnerships, and personal indiscretions with a few carefully chosen search strings. People left ghosts in the machine, and she knew how to find them. Caleb Vance was different. He was a ghost of a different sort. There was almost nothing. No social media presence. No credit history beyond a few local utility bills. No digital footprint to trace. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself. A man living completely off the grid, in a world that demanded constant connection. It took her 3 hours, cross-referencing old news articles and archived corporate filings, to find the faint echo of the man he used to be. Caleb Vance, lead structural engineer. A prodigy, lauded for his innovative designs in sustainable architecture. He had been a partner at a top-tier firm in the city. He had a wife, an architect named Annalise. The articles spoke of them as a power couple, a brilliant pair, set to redefine the urban landscape. Then, 7 years ago, the trail went cold. He had simply vanished, resigned from his firm, sold his city apartment, and disappeared. The same year, Annalise had died. The last article she found was a short, terse report on a construction site incident. The Northwood Tower collapse. A catastrophic failure of a support girder during a late-stage build. 3 fatalities. One of them was Annalise Vance. She had been on site, conducting a final inspection. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Northwood Tower. A project developed by Thorne Consolidated. Marcus Thorne. Her rival. The man whose picture was currently splashed across business journals. The smiling predator who sat on her board and schemed to undermine her at every turn. A man her father had done business with for years. A man whose company, her own corporation, was now in the process of a hostile takeover. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The handyman in the flannel shirt was not just a handyman. He was a widower. A brilliant mind in self-imposed exile. And he was connected, inextricably, to the man she considered her greatest professional enemy. The next morning, the cafe was still cold, but the air was different. It was filled with the smell of fresh baking. Elara was behind the counter, pulling a tray of muffins from an ancient oven. Evelyn placed the unopened envelope on the counter. She needed answers. Before she could speak, the bell over the door jingled. Caleb Vance walked in. He was not alone. Holding his hand was a small girl, no older than 6, with his same serious eyes and a cascade of dark curls. She wore a bright pink coat and held a sheet of paper clutched in her other hand. This was Lily. The child looked at Evelyn with an open, unwavering curiosity that was utterly disarming. While Caleb went to the heater, Lily walked straight up to Evelyn. She held out the piece of paper. It was a drawing. A shaky, crayon rendering of a house with a huge, smiling sun above it. Smoke curled from the chimney in a perfect spiral. "This is for you," the girl said, her voice small but clear. "So you won't be cold." Evelyn stared at the drawing. It was a simple, childish offering, a transactional exchange of kindness for its own sake. It was a language she had long forgotten. She looked from the drawing to the girl's earnest face. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed. She took the paper. Her hand trembled slightly. "Thank you." Caleb had watched the exchange from across the room. He said nothing, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He turned back to the heater. His focus absolute. He had a small, custom-machined piece of brass in his hand. He fitted it into the unit with a quiet click. He struck a long match, and with a soft whoosh, a blue flame bloomed to life. Warm air began to push back against the room's oppressive chill. He packed his tools. Lily went to his side, slipping her hand back into his. Evelyn held up the envelope. "This is yours. My father." He finally met her gaze directly. His eyes were grey, the color of a winter sky. "I know what it is." He made no move to take it. He simply looked at her, a silent challenge, as if he was waiting to see what she would do with the knowledge she now possessed. He and Lily left, the bell announcing their exit. Evelyn was left in the growing warmth, holding the crayon drawing in one hand and the letter in the other. One was a simple picture of a home, the other was a key to a tragedy that connected them all. The CAF no longer felt like a liability to be liquidated. It felt like the epicenter of a story she was now a part of, whether she wanted to be or not. And the value of that story was something she was only just beginning to calculate. The warmth from the repaired heater was a fragile truce against the encroaching winter. For 2 days, an uneasy quiet settled over Havenwood. Evelyn found herself in a strange limbo, caught between the world she knew and the one she had stumbled into. She spent her time at the CAF, ostensibly sorting through her grandmother's disorganized paperwork, but really, she was watching. She watched Ilara move with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had occupied the same space for a lifetime. She watched the townspeople come and go, their interactions a quiet tapestry of shared histories. They spoke to Caleb with a mixture of respect and gentle protection, as if he were a precious resource the town had claimed as its own. The quiet was shattered by a phone call. The name on her screen was Marcus Thorne. She stepped outside into the biting wind, the cold a familiar shock to her system. "Evelyn, darling." His voice was a smooth, polished weapon. "I heard you were communing with nature. I trust you're not planning on trading your corner office for a corner booth at some greasy spoon. Just finalizing my grandmother's affairs. Marcus, what do you want?" A friendly inquiry. "I saw the Havenwood property in the Reed Holdings portfolio. An interesting little parcel. Right on the river. Prime for development. My people tell me the zoning is surprisingly flexible." The casual predation in his tone made her stomach tighten. He wasn't just inquiring. He was circling. "It's not for sale." The words came out before she had consciously formed them. It was a reflex, a defensive posture she hadn't planned, a soft chuckle on the other end of the line. "Everything is for sale, Evelyn. You, of all people, should know that. I'm prepared to make a generous offer. It would be a shame to let sentiment get in the way of good business. Think of it as a sympathy dividend for the town. Before we break ground. Break ground for what? A luxury resort. Thorne River Estates. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? We'll be revitalizing the local economy. You'd be a hero." He saw the town not as a community, but as undeveloped acreage. He saw the people as obstacles to be bought out or pushed aside. He was the embodiment of the world she had mastered, and suddenly it looked ugly and hollow. "I'll think about it." She ended the call, her hand clenching the phone. The first attack came the next day. It wasn't a threat or a legal filing. It was more insidious. A team of surveyors appeared at the edge of the property, driving stakes into the frozen ground. They were professional, polite, and presented paperwork from Thorne Consolidated, authorizing a preliminary environmental assessment. They were marking their territory. Caleb was there within minutes. He had been fixing a fence line on the adjacent property. He didn't confront the surveyors. He simply stood and watched them, his presence a silent, immovable object. His stillness was more intimidating than any outburst could have been. The surveyors, accustomed to angry landowners, seemed unnerved by his quiet observation. They finished their work quickly and left. He walked over to where Evelyn stood on the CAF's porch. "This is his first move," he said. It wasn't a question. He knows you're here. He's testing you. How do you know how he operates?" His gaze drifted towards the river, but she knew he was seeing something else. A skeleton of steel against a city skyline. Most people only see what's flowering. They miss what's moving underneath. Thorn always starts by poisoning the roots. The metaphor was chilling in its accuracy. That evening, as Evelyn walked back to her motel, she noticed a long, deep scratch along the side of her car. It was fresh, gouged into the perfect black paint down to the bare metal. It was a message. "You are an outsider here. You are vulnerable." The motel room suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The single lock on the door seemed flimsy, inadequate. The anonymous nature of the place, which she had initially found comforting, now felt dangerous. She packed a small overnight bag. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there. On instinct, she drove not towards the highway that led back to the city, but deeper into the winding country roads, towards the faint light she had seen from Caleb's property. His house was small, simple, and impeccably maintained. A light was on in the living room. Through the window, she could see him sitting in a worn armchair, reading a book to Lily, who was curled up beside him. The scene was so peaceful, so fundamentally decent, that it felt like a world away from the calculated menace of Marcus Thorn. She almost turned the car around. Asking for help was a form of currency she had never traded in. It was an admission of weakness, a forfeiture of control. But the image of the scratch on her car, a violent scar on a perfect surface, pushed her forward. She got out of the car. The gravel crunched under her boots. Caleb looked up as she approached the porch. He wasn't surprised. He stood and opened the door before she had a chance to knock. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He simply stepped aside. "The guest room is ready." She stepped over the threshold, leaving the cold, dark world of threats and intimidation behind. She was seeking refuge, not as a powerful CEO, but as a woman who had suddenly realized the limits of her power. She had entered his world, a world built on principles she was only just beginning to comprehend, and in doing so, had tacitly accepted his protection. The alliance had been forged not in a boardroom, but on a quiet porch on a cold winter's night. The guest room was sparse, but clean. A handmade quilt was folded at the foot of the bed. A single, framed photograph sat on the nightstand. It was of a smiling woman with intelligent eyes, her arm linked with Caleb's. Annalise, Evelyn slept fitfully, the house settling into a deep, rural silence punctuated by the groan of wood and the sigh of the wind. She was accustomed to the city's constant hum, a white noise that masked the sound of her own thoughts. Here, in the quiet, there was no escape. The next morning, she found Caleb in his workshop, a converted barn behind the house. The space smelled of sawdust and oil. Tools hung in precise order on the walls. Blueprints and schematics were pinned to a large corkboard. It was the sanctuary of a brilliant mind, a place of order and creation. He was planing a piece of wood, the long, thin shavings curling at his feet. The rhythmic scrape of the tool was the only sound. She held out the envelope. Her father's letter. "I think it's time you told me what this is about." He stopped his work, setting the plane down carefully. He leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed. He looked at the envelope, then at her. His expression was guarded, his grief a palpable presence in the room. "Your father and I spoke. Once, on the phone. About a month after the collapse. His voice was flat, recounting a history he had lived with for 7 years. The official investigation called it a material fatigue failure, a 1 in a million tragedy, an act of God. Thorn Consolidated paid a settlement to the victims' families. Everyone signed non-disclosure agreements. The story was buried. But that wasn't the truth, was it? Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. No. He shook his head slowly. Annalise knew. She was the project's oversight architect. She found discrepancies in the steel girder supply manifests. The contractor Thorn used had a history of supplying substandard materials. She flagged it. She wrote reports. She told Thorn directly. And he ignored her. He did more than ignore her. He buried the reports. He threatened her job, her reputation. He told her she was being hysterical. The day of the collapse, she went to the site to gather her own core samples from the girder, to get definitive proof. She wasn't supposed to be there. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. She wasn't a victim of a random accident. She was silenced. And my father? Where was he in all this? His company was the primary investor. He funded the project. Annalise sent him a copy of her final report 2 days before she died. She begged him to intervene. He never responded. The silence in the workshop stretched, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn saw it all now. Her father, a man who prized profit above all else, had been given a choice. He could halt the project, costing his company millions, and admitting a catastrophic error in judgment. Or he could trust Thorn's assurances and hope the architect was wrong. He had made a calculated business decision. And 3 people had died. The letter, Caleb continued, his voice strained, arrived a week later. He wrote that he received her report too late, that it had been lost in his correspondence. He wrote that he was sorry. He enclosed a check. A large one. Evelyn felt a wave of shame so profound it was nauseating. A check. Her father's answer to everything. An attempt to put a monetary value on a life. "What did you do?" she asked. "I burned the check. I kept the letter." He looked at her, his eyes holding a deep, weary sorrow. "I kept it as a reminder that some men build things, and other men just calculate the cost of letting them fall. I needed to know which kind of person you were." The words landed like a judgment. He had been watching her, testing her, since the moment she walked into that cold cafe. He wasn't just a handyman fixing a heater. He was a gatekeeper to a past that was inextricably linked to her future. The threat from Marcus Thorn had forced her to seek refuge in his home, but it was this revelation, this shared, tragic history, that truly forged their alliance. Her fight with Thorn was no longer about a corporate takeover or a parcel of land. It was about justice. It was about rectifying a wrong that her own father had been complicit in. She was her father's daughter. She had inherited his empire, his name, his ruthlessness. But standing in that quiet workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on integrity and skill, she made a choice. She would not inherit his mistakes. The plan began to form in the quiet stillness of Caleb's house. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full, focused power of her intellect shift from a tool of acquisition to a weapon for justice. The cold, calculating machinery of her mind, once used to orchestrate hostile takeovers and dismantle competitors, was now aimed squarely at Marcus Thorn. She needed more than Caleb's story. A jury would see him as a grieving husband with a vendetta. Thorn's lawyers would paint him as unstable, his testimony tainted by personal tragedy. She needed irrefutable proof, the kind of hard data that couldn't be dismissed. She needed Annalise's report, the one her father had claimed to have lost. She called Ilara. The question was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a thread of hope. "My father. He sometimes sent you things for safekeeping, business things he didn't trust in the city. Did he ever send you a package?" "Around 7 years ago." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Elara's voice, when it came, was quiet and laced with a sorrow that spanned decades. Your father was a complicated man, Evelyn. He lived in a world of predators, and he learned to be one himself. But he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what was real. Come to the cafe. There's something in your grandfather's desk. The desk was a massive oak piece in a small back office, covered in years of dust. It was the one thing in the cafe that spoke of a different life, a life of ledgers and important documents. Elara ran a wrinkled hand over the wood. Your grandfather believed some things should be kept under lock and key, not to hide them, but to protect them. She pressed a knot in the ornate carving on the side of the desk. A section of the paneling clicked open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was not a file or a report. It was a small, silver USB drive. Your father gave this to me the last time he visited, Elara said. He told me it was an insurance policy. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to you, but only if you came here yourself. Only if you were willing to see what he had left behind. Evelyn took the drive. It was cold to the touch, a small, solid piece of her father's complicated legacy. Back at Caleb's house, she plugged it into her laptop. There was only one file on the drive. It was a scanned copy of Annalise Vance's full report. Dozens of pages of meticulous data, metallurgical analysis, and supply chain tracking. It was a damning indictment of Thorn Consolidated and the contractor they had used. But there was more. At the end of the report were appended files, audio recordings. Her father, a man who recorded every important meeting, had recorded his final, furious phone call with Marcus Thorn. Thorn's voice was slick with dismissal. It's a shakedown, Arthur. The woman is an emotional liability. The contractors have been vetted. We proceed as planned. Her father's voice was strained, tired. If you're wrong, Marcus, I'm never wrong about the bottom line. The project is insured. The risk is calculated. Handle it. The click of the phone hanging up was a sound of final, chilling dismissal. This was it. The smoking gun. Her father hadn't lost the report. He had been overruled, bullied into silence by Thorn. He had kept the evidence, perhaps out of a flicker of conscience, or perhaps as a final move in a game he knew he was losing. Evelyn's hands were steady as she closed the laptop. The grief for her father was a complex, tangled thing, mixed with anger and a new, reluctant understanding. He had been weak when he should have been strong, but he had left her the tools to finish the fight. She looked at Caleb, who had been watching her, his face a mask of tense anticipation. I have it, she said. I have it all. Now, she was no longer a victim of Thorn's conspiracy. She was the architect of his downfall. She moved with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. She made one call, to Jessica, her loyal assistant in the city, a woman who valued competence and loyalty above all else, and who had a deep, quiet dislike for Marcus Thorn. Jessica, I need you to call an emergency meeting of the board. The agenda is the Thorn acquisition, and I need you to book a conference room. No, not at our headquarters, a neutral location. And I need a secure closed-circuit video link. She laid out the plan. It was simple, elegant, and ruthless. She would use the very tools of the corporate world, the boardroom, the shareholder vote, the binding resolution, to dismantle the man who had corrupted it. Caleb watched her, a silent partner in the unfolding strategy. He saw the woman she was, the powerful, formidable executive. But he also saw the change. Her movements were no longer driven by profit or ambition, but by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She was using the language of her world to deliver a verdict from his. The day before the meeting, she walked with him along the fence line of his property. The winter air was sharp and clean. "Are you coming with me?" she asked. He stopped, looking out over the dormant fields. "This isn't my world, Evelyn, no," she said, meeting his gaze. "But this is your fight. I'm just the weapon. I need you there. I need to remember why I'm doing this." He gave a slow nod. He would be her moral anchor, a silent reminder of the human cost that never appeared on a balance sheet. The alliance was complete. The plan was in motion. The confrontation was set. The boardroom was a sterile, glass-walled cage suspended 40 floors above the city. It was a world of polished chrome, black leather, and panoramic views of a skyline that celebrated men like Marcus Thorne. It was Evelyn's natural habitat, a place where she had always felt powerful, in control. Today, it felt like a foreign country. Caleb stood by the wall, near the door. He wore a simple dark jacket and trousers. He didn't look out of place. He looked grounded, an anchor of quiet reality in a room built on illusion. His presence was a silent testament to the stakes of the meeting. He was the ghost at the feast. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the long, mahogany table, exuding an aura of smug, unassailable confidence. He smiled at Evelyn as she entered, a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evelyn, a pleasure. I trust you've come to your senses about that charmingly rustic piece of dirt. My offer still stands." Evelyn didn't smile back. She took her seat opposite him. She placed her laptop on the table and opened it. Her movements were calm, deliberate, the board members. A collection of grim-faced men and women who measured success in quarterly reports, shifted uncomfortably. They could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. This was not going to be a standard acquisition review. "The acquisition of Thorne Consolidated is off the table," Evelyn began, her voice even and clear, cutting through the tension. "Instead, we are here to discuss the immediate removal of Marcus Thorne from his position on this board and the initiation of a full, independent investigation into his role in the Northwood Tower collapse 7 years ago." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "This is an outrage. On what grounds are you making these baseless accusations? This is a transparent attempt to derail our deal. On the grounds of gross negligence, corporate malfeasance, and conspiracy to conceal critical safety failures," Evelyn stated, her eyes locked on his. She pressed a key on her laptop. The large screen at the end of the room, usually reserved for financial projections, flickered to life. The first document appeared, Annalise Vance's final report, its pages filled with damning data. "Stolen documents," Thorne sneered, though a bead of sweat had appeared on his temple. "Inadmissible," the ravings of a disgruntled employee. Evelyn advanced to the next file. It was a series of emails. Thorne, instructing his subordinates to bury the report. Thorne, threatening the steel contractor into silence. His face had gone pale. And finally, Evelyn said, her voice dropping slightly, "There is the matter of my father's involvement. As you all know, Reed Holdings was the primary investor. Marcus has long maintained that my father was fully aware and supportive of his decisions. He has used my father's legacy to bolster his own position for years." She clicked one last time. The room was filled with the sound of the audio recording. Her father's worried voice. Thorne's arrogant dismissal. "The risk is calculated. Handle it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an empire crumbling. The board members stared at Thorne, their expressions a mixture of horror and cold fury. They were not moralists, but they understood the catastrophic liability he had just become. Evelyn closed her laptop. Her work was done. She had presented the evidence, methodically, dispassionately, just as she would have presented a financial analysis. The vote was a formality. Unanimous, Marcus Thorne was removed, his reputation and career destroyed in the space of 10 minutes. Security was called. Legal counsel was summoned. The machine of corporate justice, slow and ponderous, had begun to grind. As Thorne was escorted from the room, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, his eyes met Evelyn's. In them, she saw not just defeat, but a flicker of genuine confusion. He couldn't understand why she had done it. To him, it was bad business. She had sacrificed a profitable acquisition for a principle. It was a language he would never comprehend. Evelyn stood. She looked at Caleb. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement she needed. Her victory was not in the destruction of Marcus Thorne. It was in that quiet nod. It was in the knowledge that she had used her power not for gain, but for restitution. She walked out of the boardroom, leaving the fallout and the legal battles to the men and women in suits. She had won the war in the only way that mattered. She had rectified the past. She had honored the memory of a woman she had never met. And she had, finally, stepped out from under the long, cold shadow of her father's legacy. The consequences of that victory were already settling into place, not as debits on a ledger, but as a profound and seismic shift in the foundation of her own life. The aftermath was a quiet dismantling. Evelyn did not return to her corner office. She managed the transition from a distance, through a series of terse emails and decisive phone calls. She appointed an interim CEO, a woman known for her ethical rigor. She instructed her legal team not just to cooperate with the authorities investigating Thorne, but to actively assist them, providing every piece of evidence she had uncovered. Then, she began to sell. She divested herself of the parts of the Reed Holdings empire that her father had built on ruthless principles. The predatory investment arms, the speculative real estate ventures, the subsidiaries that skirted environmental regulations. She sold them off, piece by piece, shrinking the empire down to its solid, ethical core. With the profits, she established a foundation, the Annelies Vance Foundation for Integrity in Architecture. It would fund scholarships for young engineers and architects and provide pro bono legal support to whistleblowers in the construction industry. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of correction, a rebalancing of a ledger that had been skewed for far too long. Her final act was an email to the board of directors. It was 2 sentences long, a formal letter of resignation, effective immediately. She sold her city apartment, the sprawling glass penthouse that overlooked the park. She packed a single suitcase, leaving behind the designer clothes, the expensive art, the artifacts of a life that no longer felt like her own. She kept the crayon drawing of a house with a smiling sun. Her black sedan, its deep scratch still unrepaired, felt different on the highway heading north. It was no longer an instrument of power, but simply a way to get from one place to another. From a life she was leaving to a life she had not yet defined. She didn't know if she was being brave or foolish. She only knew that the thought of another board meeting, another negotiation, another calculated acquisition felt like a slow death. The air in that world was too thin to breathe. When she pulled up the gravel driveway to Caleb's house, he was on the porch, sanding a piece of wood. He looked up, his hands stilling their work. He was not surprised to see her. It was as if he had been waiting. She got out of the car, the quiet of the countryside settling around her like a blanket. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It smelled real. She didn't say anything. There were no words for the transformation she had undergone. It was too profound to be contained in a sentence. He nodded towards the house. Lily was at the window, her small hand pressed against the glass. She was smiling. The return was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet arrival. An exhale after holding her breath for a lifetime. She had shed the skin of her old life, not knowing what, if anything, would grow in its place. She had chosen the unknown over the unbearable. The final, symbolic act happened a week later. It was a Saturday. The sun was pale, a weak winter sun, but the air was still. Caleb was replacing a section of fence that bordered the east pasture. The old posts had rotted at the base. He worked with his usual quiet competence, digging new holes, setting the posts, tamping the earth around them until they stood firm and true. Evelyn came out of the house, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She had traded her tailored suits for jeans and a thick wool sweater. The clothes felt comfortable, honest. She handed him a mug. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was the first time they had touched, a brief, accidental contact that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. She watched him work for a moment, then picked up the spool of wire. "I can help." He showed her how to stretch the wire, how to attach it to the posts with the heavy staples. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. The shared task was a language of its own, a conversation without words. It was about building something, not acquiring it. About mending what was broken. Lily came running out of the house, her pink coat a bright splash of color against the muted winter landscape. She carried a small, lopsided sandwich on a plate. She held it up for Evelyn. "For you," she said, "for helping." Evelyn took the sandwich, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a simple, perfect moment. A man, a woman, and a child. A small, complete circle of quiet decency. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow-dusted fields, they stood back to admire their work. The new section of fence was straight and strong. It was a clear, definite line against the wilderness. Caleb reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a speck of sawdust from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, deliberate, and it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In that small gesture, a universe of unspoken understanding passed between them. It was not a promise of a future, but an acknowledgement of a present they were building together, one fence post, one quiet moment at a time. Some fences mark where land ends, others mark where it begins.